Sarah Mitchell's morning began like a chain of small disasters. Her alarm didn't go off at 6 a.m. as planned, and she woke up to her 12-year-old son Tommy shaking her shoulder at 6:45 a.m. "Mom, the school just called. There's a water pipe burst, and they're closing for the day," Tommy said, still in his pajamas. Sarah sat up quickly, her heart racing. As a single mother and the district's lead prosecutor, she had learned to handle emergencies, but today was different. She had three major cases to present in court, and Judge Harrison, the new judge everyone talked about, was presiding. The digital clock on her bedside table seemed to mock her as she rushed through her morning routine. Her usual neat appearance suffered as she hurriedly pulled on a navy blue pantsuit that needed ironing. Her normally well-styled hair had to make do with a quick brush and hairspray. "Mrs. Johnson can't take Tommy today," Sarah's mother said over the phone. "She's got the flu." Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Her mother, who usually helped with Tommy, was in Atlanta visiting Sarah's sister who had just had a baby. The regular babysitter was sick, and now the school was closed. "Tommy," Sarah called out while putting on her shoes, "get dressed, buddy. You're coming to the courthouse with me." Tommy's face lit up. At 12, he found the courthouse exciting, even though Sarah always made him sit quietly in her office with books and his tablet when she had to work. The morning traffic was worse than usual. Rain poured down in heavy sheets, making the roads slippery and slow. Sarah's fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel as she watched the clock on her dashboard tick closer to 8:30 a.m. when court would begin. "Mom, you forgot to eat breakfast," Tommy pointed out, munching on a granola bar from his emergency snack stash in the car. "I'll grab something later," Sarah replied, though they both knew she probably wouldn't. After 15 years as a district attorney, Sarah had gotten used to missing meals when work got busy. The courthouse parking lot was another challenge. Her reserved spot, which she'd had for the past 5 years, was blocked off with orange cones and a maintenance sign. The rain had flooded part of the lot, and workers were trying to fix a drainage issue. Sarah drove around for precious minutes, finally finding a spot in the public section, far from the courthouse entrance. She grabbed her umbrella, but the wind immediately turned it inside out. "Great," she muttered, reaching for her briefcase stuffed with case files. "Tommy, stay close to me." They ran through the rain, Sarah trying to shield both Tommy and her important documents. By the time they reached the courthouse steps, her carefully applied makeup was running slightly, and her suit was spotted with rain. The security guard, Joe, who had known Sarah for years, raised his eyebrows at her unusual appearance but quickly helped them through the security check. "Rough morning, Miss Mitchell?" he asked kindly. "You have no idea, Joe," Sarah replied, attempting to fix her hair in the reflection of the security scanner. "Can you keep an eye on Tommy in my office? I've got to get to courtroom 3. "Of course, ma'am. Tommy and I will have a great time," Joe smiled, winking at Tommy. Sarah kissed Tommy's forehead and handed him his backpack. "Be good, okay? I'll check on you between cases." Looking at her watch, Sarah saw it was already 8:35 a.m. She was late, something that hadn't happened in years. Her heart pounded as she hurried toward courtroom 3, her wet shoes making squeaking sounds on the marble floor. Just before entering, she tried to make herself presentable, smoothing her damp hair and straightening her jacket. Sarah Mitchell had built her reputation on professionalism and excellence. She was known for her sharp mind and attention to detail, not for being late and disheveled. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 3, not knowing that her day was about to become even more challenging. The new judge, Richard Harrison, was already seated at the bench, and his reputation for being strict about punctuality was about to clash with his own prejudices in a way that would change both their lives. Judge Richard Harrison sat straight in his high-backed leather chair, looking down at the morning's case files. At 55 years old, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he took pride in running his courtroom with strict discipline. Only 2 months into his position at this courthouse, he was determined to make a name for himself. The courtroom was quiet except for the gentle shuffling of papers and whispered conversations. The regular morning crowd filled the wooden benches, lawyers in pressed suits, defendants nervously adjusting their ties, and court staff going about their routine duties. When the heavy doors squeaked open at 8:35 a.m., Judge Harrison didn't bother looking up. The sound of wet shoes squeaking against the floor irritated him. He had made it clear that his court started precisely at 8:30 a.m., no exceptions. Through his reading glasses, he noticed someone hurrying toward the front of the courtroom. From his elevated position, he could only see a woman in what appeared to be a rain-soaked outfit, her hair slightly messy, looking nothing like the sharp attorneys he was used to seeing. "You're late," he announced firmly, still not looking up from his papers. "This court begins at 8:30 a.m. sharp." The woman opened her mouth to speak, but Judge Harrison raised his hand to silence her. Several regular courthouse employees exchanged worried glances, recognizing the district attorney despite her unusual appearance. "In my courtroom," Judge Harrison continued, his voice stern, "we respect time. I assume you received the notice about court timing when you were summoned." He finally looked up, but only briefly, seeing what he assumed was another unprepared defendant. The bailiff, Officer Rodriguez, tried to intervene. "Your Honor, that's—" "Just a moment, officer." Judge Harrison cut him off. "I'm addressing this situation." He shuffled through some papers on his desk, pulling out a standard fine form. The woman stood perfectly still, her briefcase held tightly in her hand. The court clerk, Mrs. Peterson, was now frantically trying to get the judge's attention, waving a small note, but he ignored her. "Given your late arrival and," he paused, looking disapprovingly at her rain-soaked appearance, "casual approach to court proceedings, I'm issuing a $200 fine for contempt of court." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Several attorneys present began whispering among themselves. The court reporter's fingers froze over her stenotype machine. "Your Honor," the woman began again, her voice calm and professional, "if I may." "You may pay the fine at the clerk's office," Judge Harrison interrupted, still writing on the form. "And in the future, I suggest you show more respect for this court by arriving on time and dressing appropriately." The woman straightened her spine, her expression composed but firm. "Your Honor, I am District Attorney Sarah Mitchell, and I'm here to prosecute 3 cases on today's docket." The pen in Judge Harrison's hand stopped moving. For the first time, he truly looked at the woman standing before him. His face, usually pink from high blood pressure, turned pale. Sarah Mitchell's reputation preceded her. She had won numerous high-profile cases and was known throughout the state for her brilliant legal mind. She was also known for her grace under pressure, which she was demonstrating at this very moment. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Judge Harrison could hear the ticking of the large clock on the wall, each second emphasizing the magnitude of his mistake. "I apologize for my tardiness," Sarah continued professionally. "There was an emergency at my son's school, and the courthouse parking situation this morning was challenging due to maintenance work. I have all the necessary files for today's cases ready." She held up her briefcase as evidence. Judge Harrison's mouth opened and closed several times before he found his voice. "Miss Mitchell, I apologize for my assumption. Please, proceed with the first case." But the damage was done. The attorneys present had already started documenting the incident on their phones. The court clerk was shaking her head disapprovingly. Officer Rodriguez looked uncomfortable at his post. As Sarah organized her files at the prosecutor's table, the whispers in the courtroom grew louder. Judge Harrison's hasty judgment, based solely on appearance and without proper attention to who was actually standing before him, had just created a situation that would have repercussions far beyond this rainy morning. The first case was about to begin, but everyone knew that the real case, the one about prejudice and assumptions in the justice system, had already started. The morning session of court proceeded with an uncomfortable tension hanging in the air. Sarah Mitchell handled her cases with remarkable professionalism, but everyone could feel the strain between her and Judge Harrison. Every time their eyes met, the judge quickly looked away, his face showing a mix of embarrassment and regret. During the first case, a simple theft charge, Sarah's voice remained steady and clear. She presented her evidence methodically, just as she had done hundreds of times before. But today was different. The other lawyers in the courtroom watched her with newfound respect, impressed by her composure after the morning's incident. "The state calls its next witness," Sarah announced, standing tall despite her still damp suit. Some of the younger attorneys in the back rows were typing rapidly on their phones, no doubt sharing the morning's events on social media and legal forums. Meanwhile, in Sarah's office, Tommy sat with Officer Joe, working on his homework. "Is my mom okay?" Tommy asked, noticing the worried looks people gave as they passed by the office's glass windows. News traveled fast in the courthouse, and even Tommy could sense something was wrong. "Your mom's one of the strongest people I know," Joe assured him, though he too had heard about the incident. He worked at the courthouse for 20 years and had never seen anything quite like this morning's events. Back in the courtroom, the tension peaked during a brief recess. Sarah was gathering her papers when she overheard two defense attorneys talking nearby. "Did you see how he didn't even look at her properly?" one whispered. 15 years as DA, and he treated her like some random person off the street, the other replied. "My firm's partners are already discussing filing a formal complaint." Sarah pretended not to hear them, but their words echoed what she had experienced throughout her career. As one of the few black women in her position, she had faced similar assumptions before, though rarely so publicly. Judge Harrison's clerk, Mary, approached Sarah during the break. "Ms. Mitchell, Judge Harrison would like to speak with you in his chambers," she said quietly. Sarah checked her watch. "Please inform the judge that any discussions about this morning's events should go through proper channels," she replied firmly. Several nearby attorneys nodded in approval. The news of the incident spread quickly through the courthouse. By lunchtime, the chief judge's office had received multiple calls. Court employees who normally ate lunch in the break room were now gathered in small groups, discussing what they had witnessed. "I'd known Sarah for 10 years, said Linda, a veteran court reporter. "She's prosecuted some of our biggest cases. How could he not know who she was?" "It's not just about not knowing her," responded Mark, a public defender. "It's about making assumptions without even looking properly at who was standing in front of him." In his chambers, Judge Harrison sat at his desk, his lunch untouched. He had already received 3 calls from the chief judge's office. His computer screen showed several email notifications, including one from the State Bar Association requesting a statement about the morning's events. Sarah's phone hadn't stopped buzzing either. Texts from fellow attorneys, calls from journalist friends, and emails from various legal organizations poured in, but her focus remained on her cases. She had 2 more to present after lunch, and she was determined to handle them with the same excellence she'd always showed. During the lunch break, she visited Tommy in her office. "Mom, are you in trouble?" he asked, seeing her tired expression. Sarah hugged her son tightly. "No, honey, sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and then they have to learn from them. That's all that happened today." As the afternoon session approached, more people filtered into the courtroom than usual. Word had spread, and now several senior attorneys from nearby firms had come to observe. Even a few law students from the local university had shown up, having heard about the incident through their professors. Sarah straightened her now dry suit and organized her files for the afternoon cases. She could feel all eyes on her, but she remained focused on her work. The morning's incident had become more than just a personal slight. It had turned into a moment that would force many in the legal community to confront their own biases. Judge Harrison returned to his bench, his usual confidence noticeably shaken. The afternoon session was about to begin, but the real story was still unfolding. Sometimes, the most important cases weren't the ones on the docket, but the ones that forced people to look at their own prejudices and assumptions. The afternoon session was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Chief Judge Barbara Wilson, a respected figure with 30 years of experience, entered the courtroom quietly and sat in the back row. Her presence sent ripples of whispers through the already tense atmosphere. At the prosecutor's table, Sarah Mitchell continued presenting her case, unaware of the chief judge's arrival. She was in the middle of questioning a witness when Judge Harrison's hands began to shake slightly, noticing his superior watching the proceedings. "And where were you on the night off?" Sarah began, but was cut off by Judge Harrison. "Ms. Mitchell," he interrupted, his voice different from the morning's harsh tone. "Would you please approach the bench?" The courtroom fell silent as Sarah walked forward. The defense attorney joined them, as was procedure, but Judge Harrison shook his head. "No need, counselor. Court will be in recess for 15 minutes. As the gallery watched, Judge Harrison stood up, stepped down from his elevated position, and did something unprecedented. He walked around to the front of the bench, facing not just Sarah but the entire courtroom. "Before we continue," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "I owe Ms. Mitchell and this court an apology." He removed his glasses, showing eyes that were tired and filled with regret. This morning, I made assumptions based on appearance alone. I failed to see the accomplished district attorney standing before me. Sarah stood perfectly still, her case files still in hand. Behind her, Chief Judge Wilson leaned forward, listening intently. Ms. Mitchell has served this district for 15 years. Judge Harrison continued. She has won countless cases, mentored dozens of young attorneys, and earned the respect of everyone in this legal community. And yet this morning, I saw only what my biases wanted me to see. The court reporter's fingers flew across her machine, recording every word. Several people had their phones out, but no one tried to stop them. This was a moment that needed to be documented. Your Honor. Sarah finally spoke, her voice clear and strong. May I address the court? Judge Harrison nodded, looking directly at her for the first time that day. I've been a prosecutor for 15 years, Sarah began. I've won difficult cases, lost some that still keep me awake at night, and tried every day to ensure justice is served fairly. But I've also been mistaken for a defendant, a court clerk, and even a janitor more times than I can count. She paused, looking around the courtroom. Today wasn't just about a judge not recognizing a district attorney. It was about the assumptions we all carry, the quick judgments we make, and the people who suffer because of them. In the back of the courtroom, Chief Judge Wilson nodded slightly. Tommy, who had sneaked in with Officer Joe to watch his mother, sat wide-eyed, seeing his mom stand up for herself and others. The law, Sarah continued, is supposed to be blind to everything except facts and justice. But we, as humans, often fail to live up to that standard. Today could be just another story about bias in the justice system, or it could be a moment of change. Judge Harrison listened, his face showing a mix of shame and understanding. The $200 fine form still sat on his bench, now a symbol of his rushed judgment. I accept your apology, Judge Harrison, Sarah said finally. But I hope this moment teaches all of us something about looking beyond our first impressions. Chief Judge Wilson stood up, making her presence known to everyone. I believe, she announced, walking forward, that we've all witnessed something important today. Judge Harrison, I'd like to see you in my chambers after court. Ms. Mitchell, please join us. The recess was called, and as people filed out of the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed. The tension from earlier had transformed into something different. A shared understanding that they had witnessed not just an apology, but a moment of real change. Tommy ran to his mother, hugging her tightly. Mom, you were amazing, he whispered. Sarah hugged him back, aware that her son had just witnessed an important lesson about standing up for oneself while remaining professional and dignified. As the courtroom emptied, the afternoon sun finally broke through the morning's rain clouds, sending streams of light through the high windows. Sometimes, Sarah thought, the most important victories didn't come from winning cases, but from moments like these. Moments that opened eyes and changed minds. The meeting in Chief Judge Wilson's chambers lasted for 2 hours. Outside, the courthouse buzzed with activity as news of the morning's incident spread beyond the building's marble walls. Local news reporters gathered at the courthouse steps, and social media was filled with various accounts of what had happened. Inside the Chief Judge's elegant office, Sarah Mitchell sat in a leather chair across from Judge Harrison, with Chief Judge Wilson behind her large oak desk. The room was quiet except for the gentle ticking of an old clock on the wall. The video is already online, Chief Judge Wilson said, turning her computer screen to show them. Someone had recorded Judge Harrison's public apology, and it had gone viral in legal circles. This isn't just about our courthouse anymore. Sarah checked her phone briefly, seeing dozens of missed calls and messages. Among them was a text from Tommy. Mrs. Peterson bought me pizza for lunch. Everyone keeps saying you're a hero, Mom. I've received calls from the State Bar Association, Chief Judge Wilson continued, and several civil rights organizations. They're all asking the same question. How will we address this? Judge Harrison sat uncomfortably in his chair. The morning's confident, stern judge was gone, replaced by a man who realized the full impact of his actions. I'll submit my resignation, he said quietly. That's not the answer, Sarah spoke up, surprising both judges. Running away won't solve the bigger problem. This happens in courtrooms across the country every day. The only difference is that today, everyone saw it happen. Outside the office, the courthouse staff tried to carry on with their regular duties, The day's events dominated every conversation. In the break room, veteran court clerk Mrs. Peterson shared stories about Sarah's early days as a young prosecutor. "I remember her first case," Mrs. Peterson told a group of younger staff members. "She was so prepared that she made the defense attorney look like a rookie. But even then, people would mistake her for everything but what she was, a brilliant attorney." Back in the Chief Judge's office, the discussion had turned to action. Chief Judge Wilson pulled out a legal pad and began taking notes. "Here's what I propose," she said. "Judge Harrison, you'll undergo additional training on bias in the justice system, not as punishment, but as an opportunity to lead by example." Sarah nodded in agreement. "And I'd like to help develop a training program for all court staff and judges. We need to address these biases openly, not pretend they don't exist." The local news at 5 p.m. led with the story. The headline read, "Federal Judge's Bias Exposed. A Moment of Shame Becomes Opportunity for Change." The courthouse security guards had to turn away several reporters who tried to get interviews with both Sarah and Judge Harrison. Tommy waited in his mother's office, doing homework with help from Officer Joe, who had become his protector for the day. "Your mom," Officer Joe told him, "is showing everyone what real strength looks like. It's not about getting angry or seeking revenge. It's about making things better." By early evening, Sarah finally returned to her office. She found Tommy asleep on her office couch, his math homework still open on his lap. The sight reminded her why today's events mattered so much. It was about building a better future for kids like Tommy. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from the National Black Prosecutors Association, requesting her to be the keynote speaker at their annual conference. Similar invitations had been pouring in all afternoon. As she gathered her things to leave, Judge Harrison knocked on her office door. He looked tired, but different from the arrogant judge of the morning. "Miss Mitchell," he said softly, trying not to wake Tommy, "I know saying sorry isn't enough, but I want you to know that I'm committed to doing better." Sarah looked at him thoughtfully. "Then prove it, Your Honor. Show everyone that today wasn't just about one mistake and one apology. Show them it's about real change." As they left the courthouse that evening, the setting sun cast long shadows across the steps where reporters had finally given up and gone home. Sarah carried a sleeping Tommy to her car, thinking about how a difficult morning had turned into a pivotal moment in her career. The incident would be discussed in law schools, written about in legal journals, and used as a case study in judicial training programs. But for Sarah, the most important outcome was the possibility of real change, the hope that someday no other attorney would be judged by their appearance rather than their abilities. 1 week after the courthouse incident, Sarah Mitchell found herself back in Judge Harrison's courtroom, but this time, things were very different. The judge had arranged for a special session, not for normal court cases, but for an open discussion about bias in the justice system. The wooden benches were filled with judges, lawyers, court staff, and even law students from the local university. Tommy sat in the front row, wearing a small suit he'd insisted on wearing to support his mom. Next to him, Mrs. Peterson patted his shoulder proudly as Sarah walked to the center of the courtroom. "Last week," Sarah began, standing where she had once been wrongly fined. "Something happened in this room that many people experience every day. The only difference was that this time, everyone was watching." Judge Harrison sat not on his elevated bench, but in a chair at ground level. He had removed his black robe, choosing instead to wear a regular suit. This wasn't about authority today, it was about learning and understanding. "I've been practicing law for 15 years, Sarah continued, looking around the packed courtroom. "I've won cases, lost cases, and earned the respect of my colleagues. But I've also been stopped by security, asked to show my bar card when others weren't, and mistaken for everyone except an attorney." In the audience, several black attorneys nodded in recognition. They had their own stories, their own experiences of being judged by appearance rather than ability. Judge Harrison stood up next. His voice was different from the commanding tone he'd used before. "I thought I was a fair judge," he admitted. "I prided myself on following the law exactly. But I failed to see my own bias, my own quick judgments based on nothing but appearances." The room was silent as he continued. "Ms. Mitchell could have demanded my resignation. Instead, she suggested education. She chose to turn my mistake into a learning opportunity for everyone." Sarah watched as Judge Harrison shared his own journey of the past week. He had spent hours reading about implicit bias, attending workshops, and meeting with minority legal organizations. His honesty about his failures and determination to change moved many in the room. Yesterday, he said, I visited a high school in our city's predominantly black neighborhood. I spoke to students about careers in law. One young girl raised her hand and asked if she could become a judge. A week ago, I might have given a generic answer. But now, I shared Ms. Mitchell's story, and I saw hope in that girl's eyes. Tommy beamed with pride as his mother stepped forward again. Together, Sarah and Judge Harrison unveiled their new initiative, a comprehensive training program for all courthouse staff, from judges to security guards, addressing unconscious bias and promoting inclusivity. Real change, Sarah explained, doesn't come from punishment or shame. It comes from understanding, education, and the willingness to be uncomfortable while we learn and grow. The chief judge stood up to announce that their courthouse would be the first in the state to implement mandatory bias training for all employees. Other courthouses were already calling to learn more about their program. During the break, Tommy ran up to his mother. Mom, can I tell them about the time you won that big case? The one with the bad guys who stole all that money? Sarah smiled, remembering the complex financial fraud case she won last year. Maybe another time, honey. Today is about something even more important than winning cases. Judge Harrison approached them, carrying a document. Miss Mitchell, I'd like you to see this, he said, handing her the paper. It was the $200 fine notice from the previous week, now framed with a new inscription, a reminder that justice must see clearly. The document would hang in the courthouse lobby, along with a new policy statement about equality and respect. But more importantly, it would serve as a constant reminder of how a moment of bias became a catalyst for change. As the session continued, lawyers shared their own experiences and solutions were discussed. The courthouse staff, from the newest clerk to the most senior judge, listened and learned. This wasn't just another mandatory training. It was a real conversation about making their justice system truly just. By the end of the day, several other courthouses had requested copies of their training program. What had started as one judge's mistake was becoming a movement for change in the legal community. Mom, Tommy asked as they left the courthouse that evening, do you think things will really change? Sarah looked at her son, thinking carefully about her answer. Change happens one person at a time, honey. Today, I saw people not just listening, but understanding. And that's where real change begins. 3 months after the incident, Judge Harrison's courtroom had transformed in ways no one expected. The judge who once made snap judgments based on appearances now took time to greet everyone who entered his courtroom, making eye contact and showing genuine interest in each person before him. On this particular morning, he noticed a young woman in slightly wrinkled clothes, clearly nervous about her first court appearance. Instead of making assumptions, he smiled warmly and asked her to introduce herself. She turned out to be a new public defender on her first case. Welcome to our court, counselor, he said kindly. We all had our first day once. Sarah Mitchell, watching from the gallery, nodded in approval. She was there to observe the changes she'd helped create. The courthouse had become a model for other districts, with people coming from different states to learn about their bias training program. During the lunch break, Judge Harrison joined Sarah in the courthouse cafeteria. Other staff members no longer saw this as strange. The incident that could have ended his career had instead created unexpected partnerships. I have something to show you, he said, pulling out his phone. On the screen was an email from the State Judicial Committee. They wanted him to lead a workshop on addressing bias in the courtroom at the upcoming National Judges Conference. Are you nervous? Sarah asked, remembering how far he'd come from that rainy morning. Terrified, he admitted with a small laugh. But you taught me that being uncomfortable is part of growth. Back in Sarah's office, Tommy's drawing now hung on the wall, a crayon picture of his mom in court, with the words, "My mom changes things," written in childish handwriting. Below it was a newspaper article about their courthouse's new training program, featuring a photo of Sarah and Judge Harrison speaking to a group of law students. The changes weren't just in Judge Harrison's courtroom. Security guards now greeted everyone with the same respect, regardless of their appearance. The clerk's office had removed the old signs that some had found intimidating and replaced them with clearer, more welcoming information in multiple languages. That afternoon, Sarah received a call from a black law student who had witnessed the original incident. Ms. Mitchell, the student said, I almost quit law school that week. I thought if someone like you could be treated that way, what chance did I have? But watching how you handled it, how you created change instead of just getting angry, changed my mind. Judge Harrison, meanwhile, had started mentoring young lawyers from diverse backgrounds. Every Thursday afternoon, his chambers were open to law students who wanted to discuss their challenges and concerns about entering the legal profession. The hardest part, he told a group of students that day, isn't admitting you were wrong. It's doing the work to make sure you don't make the same mistakes again. The courthouse staff noticed other changes too. Mrs. Peterson, the veteran clerk, commented that people seemed more relaxed, more themselves. It's like we can all breathe a little easier, she said, knowing we're being seen for who we are, not what we look like. Even Tommy's school had heard about the changes. His social studies teacher asked Sarah to speak to the class about justice and fairness. Tommy sat proudly in the front row as his mother explained how one difficult moment could lead to positive change. Late that afternoon, Sarah was preparing for a big case when a young black woman knocked on her office door. She introduced herself as a newly hired assistant district attorney. I applied for this job because of you, she told Sarah. When I read about what happened and how you handled it, I knew this was where I wanted to work. You showed that we can change things from the inside. Judge Harrison's daily routine now included a morning reminder he'd written for himself. Look twice, Judge once. The note sat on his bench, next to the gavel he used more carefully these days. As the day ended, Sarah walked through the courthouse hallways, noticing small but significant changes. People from all backgrounds chatted comfortably in the corridors. A Spanish-speaking family received help from a clerk without the frustration that used to be common. A young black attorney walked confidently into a courtroom, greeted with the same respect as his colleagues. Real change, Sarah thought, watching it all, happens in small moments, day by day. She picked up Tommy from the courthouse daycare, which had been another new addition suggested during their reform discussions. Mom, Tommy asked as they walked to the car, are you happy with how things changed? Sarah looked back at the courthouse, thinking of that rainy morning that had started it all. Change is like growing up, honey, she replied. It happens so slowly you barely notice, until one day you look back and realize how far you've come. 1 year had passed since that rainy morning when Judge Harrison had mistaken Sarah Mitchell for someone other than the accomplished district attorney she was. The courthouse stood tall in the morning sun, but inside, it was a very different place from what it had been. Sarah walked through the security checkpoint, where Officer Joe greeted her with his usual smile. Big day, Ms. Mitchell, he said, nodding toward the crowd gathering in the main hall. Today was the first annual Diversity and Justice Conference, hosted right here in their courthouse. Tommy, now 13, walked beside his mother, wearing a suit he'd picked out himself. Mom, can I sit in the front row? He asked excitedly. I want to see Judge Harrison's speech. The main courtroom had been transformed into a conference hall. Judges, lawyers, and court staff from across the country filled the wooden benches. Chief Judge Wilson stood at the podium, preparing to open the event. 1 year ago, the Chief Judge began, an incident in this very room sparked a change that none of us expected. Today, we gather to share what we've learned and how far we've come. In the audience, Sarah spotted familiar faces. Mrs. Peterson, who had retired last month, had come back specially for this event. Next to her sat the young public defender who had been nervous on her first day, now a confident attorney with several wins under her belt. Judge Harrison took the podium next. Gone was the stern, quick-to-judge man of a year ago. Instead, he spoke with humility and wisdom earned through months of learning and change. I stand before you not as someone who solved the problem of bias, he said, but as someone who learned to recognize it in himself. My greatest mistake became my most important lesson. The courthouse they'd known had transformed in countless ways. Signs in multiple languages welcomed visitors. A new mentoring program paired experienced attorneys with students from underrepresented communities. The security staff reflected the diversity of their city. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message. It was a photo from a courthouse in Texas, showing their newly implemented bias training program, modeled after the one she and Judge Harrison had created. Similar messages came regularly now, as their story continued to inspire change across the country. During the lunch break, Tommy proudly gave tours to visitors, showing them the framed fine notice that still hung in the lobby. "This is where it all started," he explained, sounding older than his 13 years. "My mom turned something bad into something good." Sarah watched her son from a distance, remembering how scared she'd been that morning a year ago, rushing into court with wet shoes and messy hair. Now that moment had become a symbol of transformation. Judge Harrison joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Your son's quite the tour guide," he said, handing her a cup. "He told my group that his mom and I used to be enemies, but now we're partners in justice," his words. They both laughed, remembering how far they'd come. The afternoon sessions included panel discussions where court staff at all levels shared their experiences with the new training programs. A young black bailiff spoke about feeling more confident in his role. A Hispanic clerk described how the language program had helped her better serve her community. Near the end of the day, Sarah took the podium for the closing speech. The room fell silent as she began. "A year ago, I was just trying to get through a rainy morning with a flooded parking lot and a school emergency," she said, smiling at Tommy in the front row. "I didn't know that morning would change so many lives, including my own." She paused, looking around the room, but the real story isn't about that one morning. It's about what happened afterward. It's about a judge who chose to learn rather than defend. It's about a courthouse that chose to grow rather than ignore. It's about all of us deciding that change wasn't just possible, it was necessary. As the conference ended, people lingered in the hallways, sharing stories and exchanging contact information. The courthouse had become more than just a place where justice was served. It was now a model for how justice could be better. Tommy helped his mother pack up her materials. "Mom," he said thoughtfully, "remember when you told me change happens one person at a time? I think you changed a lot of people." Sarah hugged her son, looking around at what their courthouse had become. The old building stood as it always had, but inside, everything was different. And somewhere, in another courthouse, another person might be having their own rainy morning moment. But now they had a blueprint for turning it into something beautiful.